It's quirky, it's interesting, and it's woman-owned. And so you don't have men trying to choke more cash out of it or more profit out of it.
I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Our theme this month at Seamwork is generations. When we think about generations of sewing, we often think about the way skills are passed down from parent to child. But in today's story, we're going to hear about a sewing business that's transitioned from generation to generation, and how changing times and changing owners have really impacted it. That business is Folkwear Patterns, a pattern business that's grown and changed over many decades. Haley Glenn will share today's story.
If you've been sewing for any amount of time, there's a good chance that you've crossed paths with Folkwear Patterns. Maybe you recognize them by their eye-catching illustrated pattern covers, or perhaps your mom's been sewing their patterns since the 70s. Or maybe you've adapted one of their patterns for cosplay. If you're thinking, folk what? Let me introduce you. Folkwear is an iconic pattern company that's been creating patterns based on folk and historic garments for nearly 50 years. Despite 4 changes in ownership and 2 recessions, this woman-owned business is still churning out patterns today. When I first set out to tell the story of Folkwear, I wasn't quite sure what I was in for. Of course, I'd researched the company and learned its history, but I didn't think that by the end of the process, I would have spent hours talking to all 5 unique and creative women who've owned or currently own the company. After my first interview with Molly Hamilton, the current owner of the company, it became clear that the story of Folkwear isn't about an individual. It's about a legacy, one that's entwined with fiber arts, community, and the entrepreneurial spirit. But it's also complicated by economic uncertainty and a changing awareness around appropriation. To uncover that legacy, I met with a whole cast of characters that set the stage for the folkwear that we know today. So to tell you this story, I need to go all the way back to the beginning. Like many good stories, the story of folkwear starts with a few friends who had an idea. It was 1974 in Marin, California, a county located in the northwestern part of the San Francisco Bay. 3 friends, Barbara Garvey, Alexandra Hart, and Anne Wainwright, had an idea for a new type of pattern company. Alexandra, the first founder, was a weaver living with her young family.
Well, I believe I was living in Bolinas at that time, and I had 2 very little children, and 4 and 5, something like that. And my older boy is 10 years older. And so I was very much a mom, and I was also very much a weaver. And I had an enormous loom, like 20 feet by 12, 14 feet high, in a barn that I went to work on a nearly daily basis, and considered myself to be primarily a weaver. Bolinas was kind of a interesting place with a lot of people who were not normal, ordinary folks. So the environment was exciting and creative, lots of creativity.
When I asked exactly what she meant by not normal, ordinary people, she laughed.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of very creative people, poets, authors, and we were all pretty much what people think of as hippies, although this was before anyone thought they were a hippie. So it was just on the beginning edge of that world. And handwork, just creating things with my hands and imagination was what my world was about.
Alexandra had also just published the highly influential book, Native Funk and Flash, which showcased the vibrant and eclectic fashions of the Bay Area counterculture of the time. It highlighted handmade and embellished fashions inspired by folk clothing of different cultures. It was this passion for textiles, weaving, and embellishment that she brought to the mix. Barbara, the second founder, was a seasoned home sewer with experience in technical writing.
I taught people how to run IBM machines. That's old machines, not electronic machines. And I was also writing the instructions on how to do it.
She was also passionate about travel and spent much of 1974 traveling with her husband, who was an artist.
We had a trip to Morocco. And then in 1974, and Al did a series of artworks. He was doing serigraphs about Morocco. And then we decided we wanted to go to Israel.
Anne, the third founder, worked as a fashion designer for Alvin Duskin.
I was working downtown in San Francisco for this Alvin Duskin company. And it was a wonderful place to work because Alvin didn't ever hire anybody because of their previous experience. He would hire them because he liked them and because they got along well with other people. Well, it was a pleasure working in that place. We had wonderful co-workers. And Alvin said, you can teach anybody to do some of these jobs. I want people that are smart and nice to be around. So that's what we did there.
The origin of the idea behind folkwear is a little varied depending on who you ask. Alexandra remembers a phone call between her and Anne where a miscommunication surrounding children's wear birthed the idea of creating sewing patterns for creatives like themselves that wanted eclectic clothing. Anne recalls Alexandra, a fine weaver, wanting to make DIY kits so that people could create garments from hand-loomed fabrics at home. Anne suggested patterns as a better way of helping people put their own stamp on their garments. And Barbara remembers a celebratory dinner where the idea behind folkwear was born. Like many memories made distant by time, the truth probably lies in the space between the three stories. Regardless of the exact moment of inception, the three women put their individual talents to work on the very first folkwear patterns. Alexandra describes the division of work.
Well, really, Annie was the pattern drafter, and she had the experience and the expertise. So we depended entirely on her pattern drafting. I was more of the handwork and special effects and the design, the embroidery and crochet and all of that sort of thing. So I wrote those instructions. And Barbara, you knew home sewing.
Right. Well, and I think we were handwriting
Right.
the little patterns, right? So,
and you had legible handwriting.
and my handwriting is considered extremely legible by everybody but my husband, who can't read it at all. But anyways, so yeah, I mean, between the three of us, we had everything that was necessary to create the patterns. It was really amazing.
Yeah, each one of us was essential to them being what they turned out to be.
They worked out of their homes and a big yellow school bus, creating patterns, sewing samples, and stuffing pattern envelopes.
Yeah, my husband was the chief pattern stuffer and director of the other helpers. And then Annie and Jerry bought a piece of property on the outskirts of Forestville that had a place where we made the office when we started growing.
But at that point in time, your office was a big yellow school bus.
That's right. And people would kind of sidle by one another up and down the aisles.
The first pattern that they worked on was the Gaza dress. It was important to them that the design was accessible to everyday wearers, but also had plenty of opportunity for customization. The Gaza dress is an ankle-length gown with panels perfect for hand embellishment or hand-woven fabrics. The pattern even included instructions for how to apply traditional embroidery.
And it had good embroidery, good handwork on it to make designs from and to make simpler for people who didn't want as elaborate a job embroidering. And we could use other kinds of things for the bodice.
Their patterns became a hit. When asked what they would attribute to their success, Alexandra replied,
"The beauty of the ages, all of these incredible pieces of clothing that were enhanced so well and that really needed to be saved in some way. And so it appealed to people who had that particular ethnic background. It appealed to people who were in costuming worlds. It had a lot of different kinds of coming from different places. And that plus we chose the beautiful things that we could find and shared them. And I think that made it possible for people to make their own.
Then we also did vintage garments, and everything that we published from beginning to end was something that you could adapt to contemporary life. And we didn't do stuff that was so costumey that you couldn't make something modern out of it.
Barbara recalls the moment that she really knew they were onto something.
You will remember this. What happened when we published the patterns? You remember? Something happened in like Rochester, New York, and all of a sudden there came these huge bags of mail.
Oh, we were in women's magazines, and every time a women's magazine would come out, or it was on the cover or something like that.
And it was astounding. It was astounding. And that was kind of what gave, especially Alexandra, the idea that how you can get free publicity, which we milked to the core.
Talking to the founding women, their passion for creating something that challenged the fashion norm is apparent. In a time dominated by polyester knit sportswear, Folkwear stood in colorful contrast to the Sears catalog. They wanted to share the folk clothing that they so admired with everyone. At the time, folk clothing was more readily available in cities like San Francisco. Alexandra, Barbara, and Anne wanted to share these styles with a broader audience, bringing focus to both the clothing and the traditions behind the pieces. The clothing itself stood as a symbol of the counterculture present in the Bay Area and around the world. But today, the act of adorning yourself in the cultural clothing of others might be considered controversial, and it draws into question the line between appreciation and appropriation. Anne, Alexandra, and Barbara enjoyed years of success and creativity together as a team. After several years of business together, Alexandra and Anne were ready to explore new horizons. Alexandra was hungry for new creative ventures, while Anne was eager to work more full-time.
The only reason that I sold my part of it was because I got this job at they call it a sportswear company, but it was kind of dresses, and it was, running shorts and T-shirts and the whole thing. And, it was a better, more lucrative job for me to do that than to, the Folkwear patterns was wonderful, but the actual pattern work was maybe 10 patterns a year. And I wanted a little more than that.
Barbara continued with the company with a new business partner through the end of the 1980s until the sewing industry plummeted.
There was a perfect storm in the whole sewing concept of women's sewing around that time. It was in, as I say, the mid to late 80s, where women started working as a regular, as a kind of a normal thing. And so there had been a recession, as I recall. Anyway, there's various social reasons why women started working in much, much larger numbers. And so then at the same time, the fabric companies, the fabric manufacturers, they were getting tired of selling to fabric stores because the fabric stores would buy 1 or 2 bolts of something. And whereas if they found a manufacturer of garments, they could sell hundreds of bolts, right? So the fabric stores were really, really suffering and going out of business hand over fist. And then the third thing that happened was a consolidation in the publishing field, where more and more small magazines were being bought by bigger magazines.
She made the challenging choice to close Folkwear. Near the end, Barbara had let most of the team go. She would hire temps to answer the phone. One woman was puzzled by the avalanche of emotional phone calls.
After about an hour, she said, "Why is everybody crying?" in response to our telling people we were closing the company. Mm-hmm. And there was an enormous a huge emotional reaction.
Folkwear wasn't closed for long before Taunton Press, the publishers of Threads magazine, scooped up the business. Taunton began reprinting some of the original pattern catalog and even started working on new patterns. Meanwhile, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the stage was being set for Folkwear's future owner, Kate Matthews. Kate's unique cross-section of interest in publishing and all things fiber made her the perfect candidate for the next steward of Folkwear.
Coming up, how Kate used her background in fiber and publishing to navigate economic change.
And that was just so cutthroat and ruthless to me. No regard to the history of the company or the meaning that it has to generations of women.
If you're enjoying this podcast so far, you might really like joining in at the Seamwork community. In addition to this podcast, every month we create new sewing patterns, a video class, and a monthly digital magazine. When you become a member, you get access to all of that each month, plus you can hang out and talk in our private community forum. We're all really welcoming, and it's a great place to ask questions, post projects, or share your thoughts. Right now, podcast listeners can get a special discount of 50% off the unlimited plan. That gets you access to our full catalog of over 150 patterns, and you can download as many as you want, whenever you want. It's only $90 for a whole year of patterns, plus classes, videos, magazine articles, and access to the private community. Check it out at seamwork.com/go/podcast50, or look for the link in the show notes.
Folkwear was founded by a group of friends that wanted to share their passion for beautiful handcrafted clothing, but economic recession led them to eventually sell the company to Taunton Press. In the 1990s, Taunton sold the company to Lark Books, where Kate Matthews used her expertise to grow the company.
My father was an editor at the New York Times, and he broke away with a couple of other journalists, and they started NPR. And my father's show that he started was All Things Considered. And I remember coming home, do you know that show? Yeah, okay. I remember coming home from college and sitting around the dining room table. We were trying to come up with a name for the show. And at the time, where I lived, no, it wasn't when I came home from college. We were in Albuquerque by then, and there was not an NPR station there. So I'd never heard my dad when he was on the air. But because of him and watching him and his approach to language and editing and coverage of events and the respect for other points of view, I therefore felt very comfortable in the publishing world. And but also, because of my sewing, I loved all the textile arts, and living in Albuquerque.
Kate described the moment that led to her love of weaving and eventually to the creation of Lark Books.
I remember going to the Intertribal Fair in Window Rock with my husband and being totally transfixed by a Navajo woman weaving a Navajo rug. And I just watched forever. And I went back to college and I got an independent study in art history. And in the basement of my dorm, I built a Navajo loom and found some books and wove a Navajo rug. And that's what led us to buy the little weaving store in Albuquerque, which then led to starting a newsletter, which became bigger and better and became Fiber Arts Magazine, which spawned Lark Books. And so there was always the two avenues, the textiles, the weaving, spinning, dyeing, basketry, paper making, sewing, and the writing about it and featuring it.
Kate's relationship with the Folkwear brand goes all the way back to the 70s.
Well, if you don't mind, let me back up.
Yes, please do.
A long way.
Yeah.
Back to the 70s, when they were starting Folkwear in Northern California.
Mm-hmm.
My husband and I had a weaving, spinning, and fiber art supply store in Albuquerque called Village Wools. And we sold Folkwear patterns then. And then in the 80s, in the early 80s, when we had started a magazine, we used Folkwear patterns as the basis for some of the projects. You know, like let's start with the Romanian blouse pattern and explore embroidery techniques. So we had a kind of a trade partnership with the Folkwear women. And during that recession of the early 80s, when they had a hard time keeping Folkwear going, they sold it to Taunton. Well, because we were in publishing with the magazines we started and the books we published through Lark Books and Fiber Arts, we had become sort of professional friends with the Romans, the publishers at Folkwear. And so we were very interested when they took on the company and they got it going for a while. But when they decided to focus on their core business of publishing and they decided to get rid of this sort of odd little, sideline, this pattern company, we were the first ones they called because our magazines and books were already in that field of crafts and fiber. And so we bought the magazine.
Kate ran Folkwear for the years that it was owned by Lark Books, but eventually she was able to buy the business. Once again, Folkwear was owned and operated independently by a woman. Kate sees Folkwear as a reflection of the matriarchal tradition of needle arts.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there are women out there who's, when I had Folkwear, I'd get phone calls from women who would say, my mother made me the prairie dress when I was 4 years old, and now I've got a 4-year-old, and I want to make her the prairie dress. So it's fantastic the way it's been passed along, much like needlework traditions in general. They've been passed from grandmother to mother to daughter, aunts and, cousins. It's all sort of matriarchal, the sort of the tradition of many of the needle arts and fiber arts.
When I asked her what she thought contributed to Folkwear's longevity, she replied,
"It's quirky, it's interesting, and it's woman-owned. And so you don't have men trying to choke more cash out of it or more profit out of it. Just trying to sit back and say, well, gee, maybe we don't need to keep growing and growing and growing, because I think that strangles the life out of a lot of companies when they get too big. So I think that the woman-owned is definitely a gift that, Folkwear has.
But while she feels proud of carrying on the tradition of fiber arts, she battled with the implications of being a white woman selling cultural clothing.
I've had in a way, it's a real moral dilemma for me. It has been a real moral dilemma because on the one hand, I feel like what gives me the right to sell, say, the Korean hanbok as a traditional pattern? And yet, on the other hand, mostly the way I feel is that Folkwear has, I think, been very respectful of the traditions of these garments. Do you understand my dilemma? Sometimes I think, here, I'm a white girl, I'm a white broad, who am I to be out there peddling a Japanese pattern, a Korean pattern? And then I say, hey, nobody else is, and these patterns deserve to survive.
These are some of the same questions I've asked myself as I dove into the story of Folkwear. It brings me to ask if the benefit of sharing the beauty of these garments and educating people on their history and origin offsets the fact that this business is owned by white women. This moral dilemma wasn't the only thing that Kate had to grapple with. In her time as the owner of Folkwear, another recession hit. During this time, she did everything in her power to ensure the survival of the business, from negotiating smaller print runs with the printer to creating standalone projects and knitting patterns based on the instructions from older patterns.
I hated letting patterns go out of print, but I had to cut back. And at one time when I was trying to sell Folkwear before Molly came along, I talked to the guys at McCall's. They were interested in picking it up. But the first thing they were going to do was disappear, 50 of the patterns, maybe 70. They wanted me to choose the 18 most popular patterns, and those were the only ones that they were going to keep going. And I thought, well, Folkwear's a really little company, which is a blessing because it maybe can afford to keep all of those patterns in print. And that was just so cutthroat and ruthless to me. No regard to the history of the company or the meaning that it has to generations of women. So that was really hard because that was a possible sale, right when I really needed it. And then about 9 months later, Molly came along. And that was just so perfect. So perfect.
Molly is the current owner of Folkwear. She's been fascinated with sewing since she was a little girl watching her grandmother make clothing. Molly, like so many of us, started out by making clothing for her Barbie dolls. But she didn't fall into the sewing business right away.
Yes. So I went to undergraduate at Chapel Hill at UNC. And my background was all in sciences. So biology, ecology, botany. I have a master's in crop science at NC State University. And I focused in agriculture. So I took the ecology and have it in a sort of applied way to agriculture. So I worked for North Carolina State University for 13 years in an organic grain program. So I worked with farmers to grow and market organic corn, wheat, soybeans, so commodity crops.
As a young adult, Molly began to travel. It was through her travels that she discovered a love for textiles that reignited her passion for sewing. In her free time, Molly would sew for herself and for her children. This connected her with the local sewing community, and it was through this community that she came to know Kate Matthews.
I went to a talk she was giving in Asheville at it was sort of a local textile group talk. And she said that she was really interested in retiring and she wanted to sell this company to somebody young woman who could keep it going and run a business. And I was fascinated by the company. The talk was amazing. She had the Folkwear samples and talked about the history of the company. And I thought, that is exactly, I could definitely do that. But at the time I had 2 little children still not in school, and I was working another job and I was running another little company. And so I was like, that's not going to happen.
But about a year later, things changed. Molly found herself in a position where she could take on Folkwear. She gave Kate a call, and things fell into place from there. She was able to buy the company that spoke to her. Folkwear embodied her passion for sewing, textiles, women, and the cultures of the world.
I really think that the passion that the women who started the company for authentic textiles, authentic garments, and authentic handwork, the connection between women who are creating garments as well as the embellishments for the garments, that really appeals to me. And I meet people all the time and hear from people all the time who have been Folkwear fans from the very beginning. They loved the company, and I just love that there's this obvious passion behind the patterns, a love of history, a love of culture, a love of geography, a love of sewing and creativity that comes through from the the first women who started the company and has continued on, that really has pushed the company forward and stayed with it. And I think that's just an incredible legacy.
But the world is a different place than it was in 1974. And the conversations we're having around cultural clothing have shifted. Cultural appropriation is real and present throughout fashion. So how does a company like Folkwear, with a tradition of sharing the cultural clothing of the world, put these patterns forth with respect and appreciation?
I feel like we do the best we can, and I'm sure we're not perfect. And I feel like with the way that we try to keep appreciation as our North Star is to make sure that we aren't getting the credit. Like we want to show that this pattern, this clothing has, we want to recognize and promote the place, the culture, the people that this garment came from, that this is something that this country, this culture, these people have given the world that is beautiful and can be recognized and appreciated and understood. And I think that's what we hope we're doing.
When I asked exactly how she emphasizes those values, Molly stresses the importance of sharing the culture and history behind each garment.
So the garments do have a lot of history and culture. Folkwear as a company works to make sure that those cultural and historical stories are heard. So almost all of our patterns have some kind of detailed information on how the garment was worn, when it was worn, why it was worn the way it was, why the handwork or the embellishments are done the way they are, and how they're done. Because that's an important part. That it's not just clothing. The clothing means something. The clothing has significance.
But sewing inherently leaves so much in the hands of the maker. Without a doubt, folk sewing patterns can be used to turn a culture into a costume. But surprisingly, when you scroll through Folkwear Patterns hashtag on Instagram, you'll find very few examples of this. Molly focuses on the ways in which folkwear brings customers closer to their heritage.
Just recently, a woman sent me a photo of her father at his 80th birthday wearing a Ukrainian shirt that she had made from our shirts of Russia and Ukraine pattern. And she was just so happy and she had done the embroidery on the front, and she was just so happy that she had been able to make something for her father to celebrate his Ukrainian heritage where he had been born and feel closer to his culture. And we get several emails or phone calls like that. A woman who's able to make a Korean hanbok for her Korean grandchildren.
Folkwear also still creates historical sewing patterns, often based on originals from the time period.
And then the dress from the 40s, the Lindy shirt dress, was from a dress that I found in my husband's grandmother's attic. And they knew the woman who had owned the dress, and so we knew the time period it came from, and as well as some of the indications from the dress that would tell. But it was hand sewn and had all these amazing darts and pleats that just were really flattering, and I loved the dress. So I was like, we got to make this into a pattern.
And this tradition of basing historic garments off of original pieces has long been with the company. The various owners of Folkwear have often turned to original garments as reference and a source of inspiration when developing sewing patterns.
And then in the past, there's a lot of like the split skirt, we call it big sky riding skirt, that came from an original from a cowgirl who was a rodeo rider in the early 1900s.
Since the history of folkwear has spanned decades, one of the challenges that Molly faces is the general upkeep of each individual pattern.
We have a lot of patterns. We have over 90 patterns in print. We have over 130 copyrights for patterns. So quite a few are not in print. But anytime that we want to reprint a pattern, there is always the chance that those patterns are not digital, which it's a very good chance that they're not digital. And because they're not digital, there's a good chance that our printer will say those plates have gone bad. because they were printed on vellum or glass plates, and they just don't last. Which then means we have to redigitize a pattern, which means we have to scan it and make sure all the lines are right and get it digitized and graded.
She feels strongly that it's her duty as the steward of the company to preserve these patterns as a record of the history of clothing.
Well, the preservation of the patterns that we have is important to me because I would like to see this company continue going for many years to come. And I think it's important then to preserve the patterns that we have because they're old and somewhat in danger of being lost due to either not being digitized or even not even being printed. I do feel somewhat of an obligation to steward this company in that way so that the patterns are preserved for future use. I also feel like it's important to preserve the patterns because they are a record of cultures and clothing and history. And I think that those things are really important and can be useful for future generations to understand how clothing was made, where it came from. And these are great records for those things.
When you speak with Molly, you get a strong sense of the connection she feels, not just with Folkwear as a company, but also the women who've led the company from decade to decade. She considers Kate her mentor.
Are sort of adventurous, feminists, really love textiles, but and running a business too. She's an astute business person with a lot of ideas, and I've really appreciated that. And she's just a lot of a fun person. Kate influenced me in ways that really kind of pushed my mind around just making clothes that look like they're store-bought. That you made it so well and so well tailored that it looks store-bought. She made me think about clothes and making clothes in a way that connects to culture, that connects to other women's work, that it doesn't have to be perfect, but you can also use really unusual and different fabrics and think about making something that is just really different. You're probably not going to find in the store. It's not going to look store-bought because you can't find it in the store.
And she even stays in touch with some of the original founding women.
So it was Barbara Garvey, Alexandra Hart, and Anne Wainwright. And they started the company, and they are still in touch with me. I often hear from Barbara and Alexandra on Facebook or Instagram sometimes. They're incredible people. Alexandra had a garment in an exhibit in New York City about 3 years ago that was one of the folkwear garments that she had created, and it was a folk clothing exhibit. And it was really, really amazing. So it's great to be in touch with them, and they'll send me ideas every once in a while, or just articles or information.
This intergenerational connection doesn't just include the women of the company, but also the sewers that have been creating with folkwear patterns since the very beginning.
I was in a store in California, fabric store in California. I think it was Stone Mountain and Daughter, I believe. A woman came up to me, and I think she'd been in touch with me a few times through Instagram, but she said, I was friends with the women who started Barbara Wainwright and the others, and I lived right next door to them, and I'm actually in some of the original photos of the garments, and I worked with them, and I sewed with them, and I loved the patterns, and so that was just really neat. And so then I went back and I was like, oh my gosh, there she is in our old pictures, and that was kind of neat to see that and to hear from somebody who was right there at the beginning with them, living with them.
For Molly and all the women of Folkwear, it always circles back to the community of creative people that they cater to.
And then what I also love about Folkwear Patterns is that I'm connecting not only with a community of online sewers or local sewers, but also with women who have been sewing these garments for hundreds, maybe thousands of years in doing that. And I will say it's not just women. There's a lot of men doing this too, and connecting with that community of creators and makers historically around the world is pretty powerful.
Looking forward into the future, Molly imagines someday passing Folkwear on yet again to another person eager to preserve the legacy of the company just as she has.
I sort of think of myself as a steward of the company. And so, yes, I hope to keep modernizing the company a bit and revitalizing it. And then, at some point I could see passing it on to another woman who was passionate and interested and willing to take it on.
That was Haley Glenn speaking with Barbara Garvey, Anne Wainwright, Alexandra Hart, Kate Matthews, and Molly Hamilton. You can find Folkwear patterns at folkwear.com. This is the final episode of Season 3 of Seamwork Radio, and it's the first season we've produced in a few years. I hope you guys have enjoyed these stories and conversations as much as we have. We're going to take some time off for the holidays and for the new year, and to put together our next season. We'll see you again with our next full-length episode in the spring, so stay subscribed for more stories. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. We'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes each month for members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice. It really helps other people to find the show, so they can hear these stories too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon. I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio.